I don't claim to be certainly a historian or a scholar of the digital. I would definitely not make that claim with Antoine Picon in the room. And in my own practice, I mean, you know, today we're on the computer all day when we're in the office, but that's no different than any other office. So I don't consider myself either, even though I was involved in the early experiments with the paperless studios at Columbia, I'm not an advocate or a partisan of the digital in architecture. What I have been is a kind of informed observer. So the fact that the exhibition is not an overview gets me off the hook a little bit because I'm going to give a kind of overview. But I don't make any pretense that this is a complete overview. It's a very personal history. It's an anecdotal history. What I was and am was a kind of informed, engaged observer in these early digital experiments, at least to the extent that they occurred around Columbia. So I want to talk about that. I want to give a little bit of context to that. I'm proposing a kind of periodization, which is sort of up for grabs, and we can certainly discuss that. So I'm going to show a fair number of images. We'll go through this fairly quickly, and then I really look forward to the discussion both after this lecture and tomorrow, where we can tease out these issues a little bit further. So as I said, for me this is a kind of interesting way to proceed because I don't really have a dog in this fight. I don't have a strong position necessarily one way or another about a lot of these things. So I can recount the history at least as I observed it. So and now this, you know, aside from being a kind of interesting diagram, and I'm a kind of connoisseur of diagrams. It's interesting to see that this diagram stops around a little bit after 1960. So I think the first thing I want to say is that I'm very aware that there's a much deeper history to computation than what is sort of our starting point here, or my starting point, which is in the early 1990s. The big sort of refrigerator computers running rolls of tape. This is Ivan Sutherland at MIT in 1963, demonstrating Sketchpad, one of the first graphic interfaces, and I think that's an important part of this history. I supervised the PhD dissertation of Ingeborg Rocker. I would send you to her dissertation for some detail in these developments, especially around Stuttgart in the 1960s, but again, I don't claim a particular expertise there. And a kind of reminder that the early computers were mechanical. This is a model of Babbage's difference engine here. And part of that logic, I think, also the kind of on-off logic is embedded even in this is an Enigma coding machine from the Second World War. Now, I want to start off with a terminological distinction. Not necessarily mine, but one which, at Princeton, we've been trained very well by Axel Killian. And we've been trained by Axel to refer not to the digital, but to computation when we're talking about the computer in the architectural terms. I think it's a useful distinction. The digital is a kind of the digital is a kind of state of being. It's a condition. When you talk about computation, you're talking about active processes. I think the digital it refers to a category which has, especially today, it has to do with the World Wide Web, with the digitization of everything. It's turned certain industries on their head, the recording industry and so on. That to me is quite different than the specific use of the capacities of the computer in a kind of architectural engineering capacities, which is what the more narrow category of computation refers to. What the digital has given us in the most banal sense in architecture, of course, is this, which interests me very little. There is not a single rendering in the show upstairs, and I think that's a great, sigh of relief, I mean, in a crude sense, you could say if you're dealing with pixels and raster images, you're in a digital world. If you're dealing with vector images, you're in the world of computation. I think there's an insight that Friedrich Kittler had in his essay Gramophone Film Typewriter, where at one point there was a medium specificity that records were on vinyl, film was on celluloid, and today, of course, all of that's been collapsed into pixels. So I think on the one hand, the digital is tending towards a kind of single medium, which is pixel based, whereas computation, I think, still retains a certain degree of medium specificity. At least I would argue. So I would throw that terminological distinction out there at the beginning as a kind of background for this sort of very loose and very overlapping. I have quite intentionally not assigned dates to any of these, but I think it is possible to talk about these four sort of phases in digital and computation in architecture. The first one, which I mean, if you want, in a crude fashion, this is sort of 80s, 90s, early 2000s, and this is the sort of present. But again, these are overlapping. There's a lot of fuzziness, I would say, between these different states. But I think it is important to pay attention to these discussions that certainly, again, in my experience and around the discussions around Columbia in the early 1990s when digital technology became available, this was kind of the backdrop to the discussions. Questions of cyberspace, this was a period of Donna Haraway's essay on thank you, yes. And the term cyberspace, of course, was coined by William Gibson in Neuromancer. So that somehow this was the texture of what we imagined the digital or the cybernetic to be. Now, of course, nobody actually had a computer in the 1980s. Or very few people really had access to the computers. The architecture of the World Wide Web was tested in '89 and began to be implemented in '90 and '91. So really this was, again, an attempt to imagine what these spaces might be. And of course, the images came from popular culture, from films like Blade Runner. And there was this sense about the slippage of identity. Certainly feminism and identity politics entered into it through people like Donna Haraway. And there was this sense that cyberspace, the digital, was a kind of fluid, vertiginous space that allowed all kinds of connectivity, unhampered by the weight of the physical in a way. So this book by Michael Benedict, for example, which came out in 1991, which attempted to kind of, I mean, there was a sort of promise that this was a space potentially for architects. I showed very quickly there, I don't know if Hani showed it in his lectures, the virtual Guggenheim that Asymptote did towards the end of the 1990s. And again, it was this sense that this was a space for architects to work in. And again, the protocols were not yet established. And this was one of, in a way, if you will, one of the promises of the digital at a time when nobody really knew what the digital was going to look like. And of course, artists and architects as well were sort of imagining this space, spaces of displacement, spaces where identity could be slippery. Bruce Nauman, Vito Acconci, and then Diller Scofidio in some of their early installations that incorporated video and media were, I think, working in this same territory, thinking about the slipperiness of identity, displacement that happened. This was, their project room at the Modern was something like 86, 87, so it was really right in the heart of this period where these ideas were being tested out architects, I think, were trying to understand what their potential role might be within that world. So that, for me, is a kind of prehistory to what happened in the 1990s when the early design protocols for the use of the computer were laid out. And clearly, I think that the two people who deserve pride of place there are Greg Lynn and Bernauer. The issue, the 1992 issue, Folding in Architecture that Greg edited, I think again is a kind of interesting piece. Although again, if you look closely at that issue, maybe a third of the projects use the computer in any way. Again, and I think this is an important point, that Greg had theorized smoothness, suppleness, continuity before he was actually working in an intense way with the software. This you can't read, but another, I think, important piece of the emerging aesthetics of the computer at this time. This is the issue of the Princeton Journal called Fetish. Fetish was a conference that took place at Princeton in 1989. The journal was edited by Greg, Sarah Whiting, and Ed Mitchell, and it came out in '92. So again, it kind of brackets this period. Fetish very intentionally worked between the Marxist notion of the fetishism of commodities and the Freudian notion of the fetish. And clearly, there's a kind of aesthetic there that I think again becomes very visible in Greg's work in the 1990s that predates the actual use of the computer. Of course, this is a basswood model. It's an Eisenman project, but of course it's a wireframe. So I think, like a lot of the work upstairs, it exists on this kind of transition mode where the notion of a wireframe, the use of a representational strategy that belongs to the computer, rendered in this case out of basswood. So, probably you wouldn't necessarily imagine this kind of model without the use of the computer, yet in '92 it's still being realized by conventional means. Some of you may have read the piece that I wrote in Joan Ockman's book where I did the history of architectural education from '90 to the present. So I had an opportunity to sit down and, you're given what seems to be a very arbitrary starting point, 1990. 1990 turns out to have been a pretty interesting moment. Of course, the Berlin Wall fell in '89, so the political landscape was changing. The first George Bush was president. John Major was prime minister in Britain. You have that great exhibit upstairs with the computers from the period, but this was high technology circa 1990. The Mac Classic was released in 1990 with a massive 40 megabyte hard drive. It's interesting. They've been making Macintosh computers since 1984. So by 1990, they could already call it the classic. But it was really the first widely available desktop computer. So again, marked a kind of transition. Nelson Mandela was released from prison in 1990. He'd been in prison for 27 years. There you go. There you go. That's an important. The outcry over the Robert Mapplethorpe photographs in Cincinnati was happening in 1990. The first digital cell phone call was made in 1990. And so I think it turns out 1990, which again falls right in the middle of the period of the exhibition upstairs. It turns out 1990 was a pretty significant moment. The other in the architecture world, the cover of Progressive Architecture, the PA Awards that year was Diller Scofidio's Slow House. Again, a project that was engaged with media and representation and video technology, not necessarily digital technology, and problems of representation. So again, I think that that's kind of important, again, kind of important marker when you think about the context of the later work and so on. So now, at Columbia, we knew about Bernard Kesch mostly through his relationship to Gilles Deleuze. The English translation of The Fold came out roughly 92, something like that. I think the other point of reference, the MoMA Deconstructivism show was 87, and if you will, this was the generation of our teachers. Peter, Bernard Tschumi, Daniel Libeskind. So, if you're talking about Greg Lynn, Hani, Rashid, Jesse Reiser, myself, these were essentially the father figures. So to some extent, there's a reaction against deconstructivism. But I think one of the brilliant things that Greg and mostly Greg, I think actually, but Jeff Kipnis to some extent, was to point out that as stylistically different as Colin Rowe, Michael Graves are, they share a compositional language that is based on fragmentation and discontinuity. The turn towards continuity, to suppleness, to smoothness, that is in turn underwritten by Deleuze well, I think by Deleuze and Guattari in general, and specifically by Deleuze's book The Fold, corresponded also to a turn away from the project of disjunction, fragmentation, and discontinuity that had in turn, been underwritten by Derrida, at least in the story that was told by Mark Wigley and Philip Johnson in the show at MoMA. So again, I want to emphasize that there was this sense of moving into a new theoretical territory, shift from Derrida to Deleuze, a shift away from disjunction, fragmentation, discontinuity to questions of connectivity, smoothness, and the supple. And I think also underwritten to some extent, and that's partly why I showed some of those images from the 80s before, by this intuition that the emerging world of the web was a kind of interconnected world that was also about kind of seamless connectivity. So this formed, I think, some of the kind of intellectual backdrop to the experiments that were conducted in those early studios, and then by people like Bernard Kesch and Greg Lynn. So I remember the discussions with Greg. Shohei was invited by Bernard Tschumi to teach at Columbia. I'm sure the exact date has come out in discussions recently. It must have been around 93, 94. And Greg saw projects like this as offering a promise that, let's say, under the modernist system, that both Rowe, Graves, and the architects of deconstruction were reacting against, you could only introduce difference into the system by introducing discontinuity into the system. And the promise of an architecture like this was that it could accommodate difference and maintain continuity. This was a big deal for us at the time. And the kind of promise that you could produce a new sense of the whole, a complex whole. Again, Sanford Quinter was around Columbia, and Sanford, with his interest in complexity theory and so on, was sort of leading us through some of these things and their connections made to Deleuze and so on. So this notion of being able to introduce difference into the system without creating a disjunctive break was, I think, again, a very important kind of underlying thing. And this was exactly what Greg laid out. This is an article that published and assembled in 1992. So again, this is before the paperless studios have been set up. And I want to point out two things here. One is that the model of the project that Greg is showing, again, no computer involved here. This is a model made by cutting up pieces of foam and bending them and twisting them. So here the supple it's a material suppleness. Now, Greg may be the only person to put together Bataille and Vitkover. These are and Colin Rowe, of course, these are the Rowe diagrams. And then just kind of sliding here into Darcy Thompson and the idea that you can take this regularized grid that's so fundamental to Western architecture and then start deforming it. But again, the notion is, as opposed to, the argument of deconstructivism, that the kind of stability and the hierarchy of conventional classical architecture is something that needs to be sort of violently attacked. Greg's proposition is no, you sort of accept that as your starting point and you start pulling it and stretching it and deforming it. And again, working off of the example of Darcy Thompson, through an incremental series of deformations, you can start to produce the difference without sort of attacking direct and head-on the hierarchies of Western classical architecture. And of course, Greg points out that the Sears Tower is also a 9-square grid, as is, I don't actually, if previous page, as is the Statue of Liberty. The internal armature of the Statue of Liberty is also a 9-square grid, and of course it supports this complex supple skin. So there's a whole argument here about the relationship between the kind of stability that is maintained in the statue at the same time that the accommodating supple skin is facilitated by the armature. So again, just to reiterate the point that the language and the operations are theorized before the actual use of the computer. And again, just to, of course, things that were also happening parallel, and of course, the Lewis House is the laboratory in a way for this new language in Frank Gehry's work. I believe Frank Gehry has said numerous times that the Lewis Center in a way was the laboratory that made Bilbao possible. But again, from among other projects, Gehry's own house in Santa Monica was included in the Deconstructivism exhibition, but in 1989, he did the Vitra building, and you have this transition from a collage-based language to a language which is all about smoothness and continuity. There's a description of Vitra which I like very much, which is that every surface that could potentially get rain has zinc and every other surface is white. So moving away from that collage language to a language based on smoothness and continuity. And then of course, Gehry in fact did have access to sophisticated computer technology in the form of CATIA. This is Bilbao, but you have upstairs very similar wireframe drawings from the Lewis Center, and also in a very direct way, what Greg in a way had sort of theorized about that relationship between the armature and the supple skin was being executed at Bilbao. And then I want to mention this project. When Greg graduated from Princeton and went to work for Peter, he became the kind of head designer in Eisenman's office, and I think it's not too much of a stretch to say that you can see Greg's hand and the emergence of his thinking in the the Cincinnati project. I don't offhand know the date of the Cincinnati project, but it's a couple of years after the biocentrum. So there's clearly a different language between the Frankfurt project and Cincinnati, and I think it has a lot to do with the presence of Greg in the office. So maybe this is a point to say a little bit about the paperless studios at Columbia. So if this is, in some sense, all of this is still a kind of prehistory to the paperless studios that Greg was working in Eisenman's office from the late 1980s up until the early to middle 1990s. I was teaching at Columbia at the time. I would invite Greg up for reviews, and then sometime in the early 1990s, Greg went out on his own, was teaching at Columbia, and started his own practice. Actually, when they got the Korean church project. The paperless studios, just a couple of very quick things about the paperless studios. It's important to know that the paperless studios were, at the beginning at least, a relatively small part of what happened at Columbia, even though they became identified very, very strongly with Columbia. There were initially two of the vertical studios out of 12 or 13 would be paperless studios. They were up on the mezzanine, sort of segregated from the rest of the studios. It was very, very important in our discussions with, I designed the space where the paperless studios were. It was very important that the norm in schools of architecture were architectural labs that were in the basement. So there was literally, we brought it from the basement to the attic, up into the light in a way. And so the idea that we were taking what up to that point had been tool, which was mostly a production tool, and making it a design tool, making it part of the studio culture by bringing it up into the studios. Nevertheless, I mean, it was incremental at first. The other thing is that the original paperless studios were Macintosh-based. They were Macintosh computers running Form Z. The association with Maya came later. In the initial setup, there were 3 or 4 Silicon Graphics machines, which were monopolized by Greg, and the rest were Macintosh running Form Z. When we initially designed the studios, we designated the balconies as model-making studios because we thought people would continue to make models. They didn't make models, so pretty soon those were colonized. And it very much had, you know, there was I would say it's accurate to say there was a certain amount of tension around the presence of the paperless studios, partly because they were so selective, that there were only 2 out of the 12 studios. And again, there were certainly members of the faculty, Ken Frampton, Stephen Hull, Bob Stern, who were highly suspicious of the computer. And there were, I remember, some knockdown, drag-out fights over reviews and so on. And I think the other thing that I would say, Greg and I taught the first 2 paperless studios in the fall of 1994. And Greg arrived to teach the paperless studios with a fully formed design agenda. This strategy of using the capacities of, at that time, also the Silicon Graphics machine were running soft image, kind of pre-Maya program, to use the capacities of the computer to simulate forces. Again, this is the operative slide here. The dictum of Darcy Wentworth Thompson, that form is a diagram of forces. Greg basically set out to simulate and model those conditions and use that as a way to generate form in architecture. So it wasn't a case of sort of looking for biomorphic form. It was really more a question of simulating the procedures of morphogenesis in nature. So if it ended up looking biomorphic, that was not a result of some desired aesthetic endpoint, although again, I think Greg knew exactly what he was doing in a way, and he knew what it was going to look like. It was rather because he was using the computer to mimic the process of form generation in nature. The other thing, again, is that I disagree a little bit with the assertion in the catalog that there was a turn away from theory in the 1990s. Certainly, people like Bernauer, Kesh, and Greg Lynn were very active as theorists. It is true that once the technology got up and running, there were a lot of people who just sort of jumped on the technology and used it in a very mechanical and sometimes formulaic way. But I think in the early stages, it was very much kind of theory. This is Greg's part of Bay Opera House project. So this is 94. So if in 92, when he's doing the stranded Sears Tower, he's working with physical models, in a sense, simulating the potentials of the computer. By 94, he's got his hands on a silicon graphics machine, although I think this is actually later rendering, but the one on the cover of his book may be from that time itself. But the second point I want to make about, and I'm by the way, I'm spending a lot of time on this period, partly because it's the period of the show upstairs, and I will run through the other segments fairly quickly. I think that as much as Greg had an impact in Peter's office, he was very much shaped by Peter, and by Peter's notion of form generation as a kind of iterative, one might even say, although actually I don't think you could say this is a recursive process, it's really more additive, where you begin with a kind of geometric primitive, and then through a series of geometrical operations of displacements and slippages over the course of these different iterations, the object gains greater and greater complexity, such at the end of the process, in a sense, all of that information from the previous stages is kind of embedded in the object. So this is a project from, I think, 1969, of course. But that sort of idea of starting with a kind of fixed form, and then now using the capacity of the computer to model these forces, but the idea that the form of the architecture, in a sense, is receiving the imprint of all of these geometric operations, I think owes quite a bit to this kind of iterative operations from Eisenman. Now, this, of course, is a later project, the embryological house, but right from the beginning in Greg's projects, you have these series of diagrams that show, the beginning of the project, the running of the series, the animate form in this case is literally animated, and then, of course, at a certain point, it has to be frozen. And it is, in a sense, the sort of index of all of those procedures that had taken place before that. So now, also, I think Greg always, again, Greg is in many ways a very pragmatic person, and always used different kinds of representations, and was also, I think, right from the beginning, committed to the buildability of these projects, and so the use of the computer where you can unfold the surfaces, and you can generate tiles that could then ultimately get fabricated. All of these things, I think, were really part of Greg's thinking right from the beginning. So I think Greg very much thought about the computer as an architect right from the beginning, and then, of course, later using the capacities of 3D printing. And I want to mention that because, again, there were people around Columbia, and in some sense, in those early days, it had a slightly cultish quality to it. You either were part of the cult of the digital or you were not, and it had its own language. It was slightly mystical and magical because that's what the computer was in the beginning. It was a kind of magical machine, and if there was a kind of high priest of the cult of the digital, it was Carl Chu. There are people, Carl, I think, unlike Greg, who always, I think, saw the computer as a way to produce architectural form and ultimately buildable architectural form. There are people like Carl, I think, again, as a student of Daniel Libeskind, who really saw the process of form generation itself and the work within the sort of virtual world of the computer as an end in itself, as a kind of philosophical and intellectual project that is an end in itself. It didn't need to have an existence outside the computer. So again, I think that has very much kind of dissipated. So, but that's one aspect. The second aspect, and you know, I think in some sense it's hard to see the originality of what Greg and Bernard Kesh and other people did in the early 1990s, because it so quickly became accessible to so many people and became a kind of aesthetic project of smoothness and continuity. Honestly, I pulled this slide a year ago for a lecture, and I don't know who it is, but I think the degree to which some of that initial work and the kind of intellectual labor of that initial work became kind of simply a kind of aesthetic project of smoothness and continuity is, again, something which I think we can be rightly critical of by the end of the 1990s and then going right up through the 2000s and up to the present. This is an image which I put in here at the end of this section just to, again, I mentioned that, you know, at the sort of origin of Greg's theoretical work and aesthetics was this conference on the fetish. I think there always has been something of that quality in Greg's work that I think is really quite conscious, that you see in this. And by the way, this is a T-set for Alessi, so you know it is an object, so a fetish object in a certain sense. All right, so this sort of first phase in my mind has to do with the sort of emergence of the aesthetics and the protocols and the theories around the early digital or computational design work in the 1990s. Now, very quickly after that, I think the next problem that arose is, okay, well, how do you actually build this stuff? And in that sense, I think it's interesting to look at the project that Greg did with Mark McInturf and Doug Garofalo, the Korean Presbyterian Church. A couple things. This was in part a renovation project. There was an original 1930s building there, which you can see here. But then, of course, you know, the project was criticized at the time because, in fact, it didn't seem to have any of the smoothness and the supple curvilinearity that had been kind of promised in the drawings. I don't actually find that quite so problematic, but you know, it's definitely there. Now, I show this in part because I want to mention Greg Pasquarelli. Greg Pasquarelli was the guy who worked for Greg Lynn and lived in the trailer on site and got the Korean church built, and shortly after that goes out on his own as part of SHOP. And this is not actually the first MoMA PS1 project, but it's really the first one that initiated the sort of sequence of young architects projects. It's SHOP's Dunescape from the year 2000, and so the second phase is also the second generation. It's people like Greg Pasquarelli, who were students of either Greg Lynn or Hani Rashid or Jesse Reiser, or who had worked for them. And they, on the one hand, they took this new language as a kind of given. They inherited the language, but I think they took on the project of fabrication as their own project in a way. So how do you actually realize this smooth curvilinear form, what are the tools? How do the protocols of design change when you're starting to think about actually realizing these things? Now, again, one thing that you see right away is there are actually still no curves. It's approximating curvilinear form by many small sections. This was one of the sort of immediate responses, was the sort of MRI section, and then you could translate from one surface to the next, but you would have, in a sense, measurable frames which could be used. If I thought I would have included a slide of Reiser and Momoto's project for Yokohama. Actually, the FOA Yokohama project again could be part of this discussion, but the opening up also to other industries, to naval architecture, for example, that's used. They know about building curved surfaces. Not accidental that Bilbao was a center of the shipbuilding industry. The idea of working with curved surfaces, and of course by this time, by the middle 1990s, I don't know exactly when Gary Technologies was created, but the working out of how you actually build kind of complex form at the scale of building like Bilbao was really being worked out at this time. But I think among the younger generation, the preferred form for experimentation became the pavilion. And I want to, I guess, confess a certain amount of ambivalence about this, that on the one hand, it became sort of the perfect vehicle for experimentation, and a lot of, I think, really interesting work, figuring out how you work with complex surfaces and questions of joints and so on that were, I always like this example, which was done with beer crates. But it also, I think, became sort of self-limiting in a way, that the pavilion as a type, there are certain issues that just don't get addressed in the pavilion, and I think it can become kind of limiting. And I have 3 or 4 slides here. I could have put together 1,000 slides of pavilions that are experimenting with different kinds of digital fabrication. Again, I think this was really important work that had to be done, and I think there's been a lot of good sort of learning and experimentation as a result of that. But I guess my concern, and the reason I put this slide, is it has a tendency to turn towards the kind of decorative as a kind of end in itself. It also has to do with the scale of fabrication. I think despite the interest in the advances that milling and so on is still operating at a fairly small scale, and the kind of promise that you could, say, take a form like this and actually have a giant 3D printer and just print it. I think it was Axel Killian who said that somebody's actually sort of calculated that to mill or 3D print a kind of normal size house with the current technology would take you something like 2.5 years. So I think the promise of this sort of immediate translation from the file to the object that's promised by the pavilion is, to me, less interesting, and I think the more complex, and one would have to say sort of partial experiments that somebody like Gary Technologies, where I remember walking by the Lewis Library at Princeton University when it was under construction, and I know that they're using super sophisticated technology, and every panel is. There were a couple of guys up there on the roof with a sledgehammer, knocking a beam into place, And then I came by another time, there were people out there with a chalk line, and they were you know, they were getting tangents on the roof. So from my point of view, that more mixed condition is still more interesting. The utopian promise of being able to kind of push a button and print the pavilion interests me less. So, okay, so the last section here is really a kind of snapshot of where I think we are today. And I would say, from my point of view, we're in a really interesting moment. We're in an interesting moment, I think, for two reasons. One is the full integration of digital or computational design technology to all architectural offices, where the discussion is no longer about digital design, the discussion is about design. And the computer is a fact of life in all contemporary offices today. And of course, this is also generational. I mean, there are you know, the kids that are working in our offices today have grown up with a computer. They're much more facile than we are, and they bring a huge level of expertise. So there's a kind of reservoir of expertise now that is available. And then also the democratization of the software and the hardware. You know, I mentioned this sort of cult-like aspect to the computer in those early days. That, you know, it had to do with accessibility. A Silicon graphics machine was very expensive, and it was difficult to learn the software. Basically, you know, the software is cheap and readily available, and it's easy to learn, and there's this reservoir of expertise among the younger people. So on the one hand, you have the kind of democratization and the widespread accessibility, not only of modeling softwares and production softwares, but also scripting. So you know, you can download physics engines from the internet, and you can do simulations and form finding in your office without a lot of specialized technology. This is not something I have the capacity to do myself, but you know, I hire people in the office to write scripts, and we can work with the capacities of computational design in what is not a terribly large and sophisticated office. So on the one hand, that's what I mean by the integration, the sort of full integration, and the normalization, the democratization of software. But then, and I should mention something like Casey Reese and Ben Fry's processing. They call processing an electronic sketchbook. Again, this notion that it's out there, it's available, and it's used by artists, by architects, by designers, and becomes widely available. And it's changing the sort of protocols of work and design. I don't know that it's necessarily, and it also doesn't necessarily come with a fixed formal or aesthetic agenda either. Although, again, I would say there is certainly a kind of iterative language here. It's about, it's field-like, it's serial, and it's again working with smaller components. A lot of very interesting work done by people like Georges Legendre. This is one of his students at the Architectural Association, where they're no longer simply, the important point here is they're no longer simply, what Greg did in the early 1990s was to take a given software platform and sort of use it against its grain. But he was still working with the architecture of the software as was given to him, as it was written by someone else. Today, there are people who are writing their own softwares. They're using some of these widely available platforms, and they're no longer subject to the aesthetic protocols that were written into those early softwares, whether it's Maya or Softimage or Form Z. And that, to me, again, is a very positive step, and one which is having, I think, a fairly widespread impact across the discipline. At the same time, there is the emergence of highly specialized research by super well-trained people, where it's almost a given if you're going to do advanced work in computation that you have the capacity to write code. And so all of the interest, again, in scripting, in robotics, in the integration of sensors into buildings so that they can be, you can begin to think about buildings as a kind of smart technology that are adaptive and reactive. Also, there's a lot of interest in the potential of measuring the performative claims that are being made for certain architectures. That is work that's not necessarily having a wide, it's highly specialized research that's not having a widespread impact on the discipline, but I think it's being conducted at a sufficiently high level that it may ultimately filter back into the discipline. So that's what I mean by a kind of bifurcation. On the one hand, the normalization, the democratization of the softwares and the hardwares. On the other hand, the emergence of specialized research disciplines that are working in a number of, I think, very interesting areas. So I'm kind of optimistic about the future. I'm personally not going to be writing code and involved in robotics, but I'm glad there are people who are out there doing it, and I think there's a potential in the future to collaborate with these specialists. But it's become a specialized discourse in a way. So again, I'm not in the business of predicting the future. I would just mention a couple of things. One is the interest in going back. This is Gare of Nice, one of these 1965 very early experiments with computer graphics, and people know my interest in field conditions. They will understand why I'm interested in drawings like this. I think there's a lot of, for me, a lot of untapped potential in thinking about the computer in the context of cities and urbanism. I mean, if there's a kind of territory that the computer has not yet deeply penetrated, or where I think sufficient research and design experimentation has happened, it's at the level of cities, and these are sort of perfect tools in a way to think about the complexity of the urban field. That's something that interests me very much. And then, there's a lot of people, artists working in this area, who have a kind of, I think again, as we get past the kind of early fascination with this new technology and the need to always be sort of on the cutting edge and working with the most complex, newest, most sophisticated tools, who are taking a kind of a much more kind of hybrid approach. I mean, Sanford Quinter's piece that was mentioned in the introduction, I took the opportunity to read it again, and he talks about taking an archaic path through the microchip. So this is an artist named Michael Gombeski, who has hooked up a scanner and a laptop to a very primitive camera, and he makes photographs like this that are working simultaneously with a 19th century technology and a 21st century technology. So I think these kinds of creative hybrids where you work between the digital and the analog, to me, are very, very interesting for thinking about the future, that I think we no longer have to, I think again, because these technologies are more familiar, more normative, that we can think about them in their kind of hybridized forms. And again, I think for me that's one of the exciting things about the exhibition upstairs, is that because you're catching a technology in its early formation, when the protocols are not yet established, there's still a kind of openness to it. And by this, I don't mean that we have to go back to drawing by hand and using the computers in that way. I think it's thinking about where we are in the present and what the potential new hybrids would be sort of moving forward from this point. And then, sorry, that's another of Michael's photographs. Michael's a guy we hired I know his work because we hired him to write code in the office, and then I discovered that he has this very interesting artistic practice. And then ending with this image, one of my favorite images, which Antoine recognized as Constantine Doxiadis. Again, Doxiadis thinking about the city. But the notion that underlying all of this, of course, is a regime of information. And of course, what has happened between here and here is that the spider's codes have been messed with, the information has been messed with, and so again, I think the sort of potential moving forward is really thinking at that level of the codes, thinking about that at the level of information, and not so much the machine itself or the aesthetics of the machine that we've come to be very familiar with and to associate with the computer. So, thank you.
Suggest or get your feedback on this. I wonder if these four kind of this linear narrative that you're saying is maybe cyclical. So once we get to a point where we have integration and bifurcation, you also start to see things like the quantified self movement, or people beginning to realistically embed technologies into their body, or the locus of the body in space and interacting in different ways. So I wonder what happens when we begin to cross over.
Yeah.
Thoughts about the implications for architecture?
Sure. I mean, look, in part, that's why I put these images towards the end, and why I will insist on the sort of 80s and the cyberspace and replicants and cyborgs as a kind of prehistory to this. No, I think, I mean, look. From my early interest in notation and field conditions, I will say the rise of scripting reignited my interest in the computer, because I can see that through the lens of diagrams and notations, and it's detached a little bit from the formal languages that were associated with the computer design. Worked in the 90s, so yeah, I suspect it's true. I mean, I would insist on there being sort of overlapping, but I'm willing to take the point there's a cyclical element as well. And also, by the way, I mean, we can also talk about parallel streams and different research agendas. I mean, there are people who've taken on fabrication as their agenda, and they're working in that territory, and there's still work to be done there. So yeah. I mean, again, I would take the caution that it shouldn't be read as a linear narrative. So, yeah.
It's not a very simple question. I love the presentation, the clarity, etc. Struck me that you started by a very strong connection between architectural imagination and social imagination. At the time, Gibson, Haraway, cyborgs at Hollywood, in other fields, etc. Then you engage a trajectory which is much more purely architectural.
Sure.
But my question would be, I think throughout the story, there is actually a connection between architectural imagination and social imagination.
Sure.
So how would you take the same itinerary, relating it to the evolution of social imagination?
Sure. No.
It's complicated.
No. Well, it's. I mean, it's an important question, and I I don't know that I can answer it fully. I mean, I would, of course, to the extent that Greg was a kind of central figure in the narrative. I mean, of course, the name of his firm is Form. So, Greg has a formal agenda, right? But I mean, certainly, I mean, if you go back to those early discussions right, in the 1990s, I mean, I think that part of the I think part of our problem, in a sense, with deconstructivism or with the fragmentation and disjunction, was that I think it had also become kind of I wouldn't say bankrupt as a social program, but I think there was first of all, there was a certain radicality claim for that, right? I mean, that there was a violence to those fragmentations, those breaks. But I think there was also a sense that as a critical strategy, that was being blunted, in a sense that the force of disjunction, as media exploded, the critical force of disjunction was being blunted by its proliferation in a way. I mean, this was 1990s was when MTV emerged, right? And if you wanted disjunction, I mean, watch 20 minutes of MTV. So in other words, fragmentation and disjunction had been fully absorbed by popular culture and kind of normalized, and its critical force had been blunted. So the proposition of, if you're still in a sense committed to difference, which could mean political and social difference, but at the same time being committed, again, if this kind of violence of deconstruction was breaking things down, the question is, what new institution are you going to put up in its place? Remember that in the first Any conference, Roberto Mangiavero-Ungers, I don't know if people know that name, the critical legal theorist, you know the name, right? I remember going to a lecture by Ungers at Princeton, not an architecture lecture, I think it was the Comp Lit department, but it was held in the architecture building, and he was saying, for him, the problem with the available critical theories at the time, this is late 1980s, was that they had strategies of critique, but they didn't have a strategy for new institution building. So I think, again, the project of a kind of complex whole is also in some sense potentially the project of a new form of institution, which can accommodate difference. So again, that may seem very utopian, and it may seem very distant from the actual architectural project, but I think to the degree that the sort of part to whole problem and the fragment wholeness problem could be seen in those terms of sort of individual rights, collective responsibility, that by experimenting with these different forms of part to whole relationships and different notions of complex wholes, that there is at least metaphorically a kind of social and political project to engage there. So, I mean, well, that's, yeah.
So,
yeah, go ahead.
So you see Deleuze's striated as a proposition on institution building?
I wouldn't put it in quite those sort of simple terms, but I think.
It's a little bit what you suggested.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I think it had to do. I mean, again, there were. Let me just put it this way. There were very intense discussions around Columbia in those days around these issues. I mean, the other players in these discussions were people like John Reichman and Andrew Benjamin, these were questions that were being raised. Maybe not, in such direct terms. But I think the other thing, I mean, again, the shift. I mean, in the broadest sense, Derrida is still a philosopher of language, and Deleuze and Guattari are philosophers of matter. And so I think the notion of just kind of exploring, I think on the one hand, that there was also a sense that architects had traction in the sort of larger project of a philosophy of matter, right? That you could in a sense produce concepts through the exercise of your own field. So in other words, it was less a matter of sort of applying a philosophical concept, although again, Greg was, by the way, I mean, he was criticized for this, that he essentially took the Deleuzian concept of the fold and applied it to architecture. I would argue the opposite, that the fold is a concept that already belonged to architecture, and so Greg was working in that territory and producing architectural experiments that potentially had some sort of philosophical or political reading. So I don't think it was an attempt to sort of co-opt the philosophical territory. I mean, I think to that degree we were, and I think we saw ourselves working within the disciplinary territory of architecture, even though there was a lot of discussion and overlap with philosophers and theorists. Yeah. Albert. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I looked right through Albert. I thought, as I saw,
okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question about the way that you set up two narratives. In a way that the first part was, I think, confirming again this idea that the digital is about a generational struggle. There was first one generation that tried to somehow defeat the fathers, and then the sons overstep the forefathers, whatever. So it's almost like a constant generational dialectic, which, however, in the second part, the one that now it's displayed and somehow for you captured more the present moment, the computers are not part of, or they do not enter the profession as part of this generational dialectic. And so I wonder whether that narrative leaves outside, on one hand, the fact that fathers, forefathers, sons, and whatever the genealogy of architects themselves somehow leaves aside that the reality that these practitioners work at the same time, despite this, despite this historicity. But on the other hand, I fear that this type of narrative leaves out as well the possibility for the outsiders of the profession, such as technicians and so forth, to have agency on the profession itself, which is what happens in the way that you framed the second part of the story, which was almost an anonymous story of the story of technologies, of apps, and so forth, without architects. So I wonder, what are the for you the clashes in these two different ways of narrative?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is a really brief overview and of a big complex story, and I think there's a lot of things that are, I mean, the emergence, for example, of the specialized consultancies. I mean, in New York, the people like Front Inc., curtain wall consultancy. But one of the things that the curtain wall consultancy bring is super high level of digital capacity that these guys in Switzerland call design to production, right? So that's a story completely in itself of the emergence of the specialized consultancy, and yeah, it's clearly much more complicated. I mean, I'll give you two examples, right? One is, of course, this is Greg is the exception in this regard. Hani picked up the technology pretty quickly too, but for the most part at Columbia, the students knew much more than the faculty. Somebody who's sort of associated with a computer like Jesse Reiser. I mean, Jesse barely knows how to do his email, But Jesse's an old friend. But he understands the potential, and again, he understands it as a designer. So absolutely, I would say, and this is more true than ever today, is that we are learning from the young people in our office, and we're totally dependent on the young people in our office because yeah, in a way, it's almost overturned, right? Because the kids who've sort of grown up digital, they swim in this water like it's natural to them, So that's one thing. But the other thing, the quote on the wall upstairs, Peter said, "I didn't know I was thinking like a computer." You could say, I'm not going to scroll all the way back, but everyone has the image in their mind of the sort of sequence of diagrams for I think I should know. I think that's house 2. One way of describing that project, there's this famous critique that Peter Cook made of Peter Eisenman's early work, where he said, yes, isn't it interesting, Peter goes through this very supposedly objective process, and it's just one geometric operation laid on another, but isn't it interesting that at the end of the day, it sort of looks like Tyranny? And we know Peter, So now, but what I would say is one way you could describe that process. Peter knew very, very clearly, of course, he loved Tyranny, he studied Tyranny very, very deeply. He wasn't going to imitate the look of Tyranny. That would just be a kind of pastiche. I think one way you could describe that early work is Peter wrote a Tyranny algorithm, and he did it without a computer. But that's an algorithmic process, basically. It's a series of rules that are executed, and it gives you a resultant, right? So I think it's really important to say that, again, this sort of algorithmic thinking is not limited, it's not bound to the machine. That happens at a kind of conceptual level, and yeah, that cuts across all generations, that I think Peter Eisenman was thinking algorithmically in 1965, 69, whenever, So that's not a generational issue. So, correct. Yeah.
I wonder if using your periodization, if you could talk a little bit about diagramming and how diagramming is related to the digital, what the digital is doing to diagramming in each one of these 3 steps, and especially what's the status of the diagram in the context of the robotics and in the context of the contemporary work that you're talking about.
Sure. Well, again, there are different notions of the diagram. I mean, obviously, the Darcy Thompson dictum that form is a diagram of forces. I think, I've argued this, and one of the any issues that emerged in the early 1990s was Solm's diagram issue, and Greg was in it, I was in it. I think one of Greg's important early essays is in that, and I think one of the important distinctions is I think for Greg the building is the diagram. It's not an architecture that's produced using diagrams, or it's not the diagram as a reduction from the building. The building is the diagram. And again, by the way, I think that's I think for Peter Eisenman, let's take house 2. Any instance of house 2 is a legitimate iteration of the idea of house 2, whether it's a drawing, a model, or the built art. In other words, for Peter, the final built house is not the resultant that everything else has to get left behind. It's one among many iterations of the diagram of house 2. He loved the fact that in the 5 Architects book, people thought that the photographs of the actual house were photographs of the model, right? So, interestingly enough, both Venturi and Peter co-opt the term paper architecture as a positive thing, right? So I think in that early phase, that was very much the notion of the diagram that was put forward. I mean, again, I will say that for me, the diagram kind of comes back with the emergence of scripting and parametrics to some extent, because again, it has to get translated through notation. I think, I kind of disagree with Mario Carpo a little bit here. Again, I think the idea that the drawing as an entity is ever going to completely disappear and that you will go directly from file to building is, to me, A, it's not so interesting, and B, I think it's a kind of utopian idea. So the filter of representation is always going to be there, and it's going to be there both the way that information enters the discipline and the way that the information is processed within the discipline. So I think the filter of representation will never go away in that sense, but I think clearly there's a shift towards notation and diagramming as you enter more deeply into the kind of information-driven realm. Yeah.
We live with finally a very pacified vision of what's happening. And, you know, last Friday, Bernauer gave a much more, you know, almost bordering the anxious, the kind of crisis of the epistemological foundation.
At the present or in that period?
The present.
Interesting,
I wanted to confront.
Interesting, yeah.
You know, do you see any crisis of the fundamental?
Oh, I see a crisis, but I don't blame the computer for the crisis. I mean, I think there's plenty of crisis out there in our field, but I don't,
Because you're, you know, in some ways you're 3-0 pyramid.
Right.
Kind of eclectic, provocative.
Yeah.
Seems strangely pacified.
Well, no. I mean, as I said, I am optimistic about the role of the computer. I'm not particularly optimistic about our discipline and, you know, about what's being produced out. I mean, but that's a different story, you know.
But you don't relate the two, you think?
No, I don't think the computer is to blame. It's not a crisis of the technology, it's a crisis of thinking. You know, I mean, I guess, you know, that to me is the difference, you know, is that if you say it's the machine that's driving it, then you can blame the machine. But if you don't think it's the machine that's driving it, which I don't actually, then you have to find symptoms elsewhere. So plenty of.
That the machine is revealing it.
The machine is revealing it. Sure. Look. I mean, you know, don't get me started. But you know, I don't think the computer is the problem. I think there are many other problems that we have to deal with. But you know, that's another question.
It's very nice to have today is the last of this series of the paperless studios. So we invited different people connected or outside the paperless looking at the paperless. And clearly I am more and more convinced that Kurosawa has already expressed this kind of, I always feel that I'm in Rashomon film. I listen, because the stories, they were very different.
Sure.
And some of the testimony were totally reticent. Greg Lynn never been at the paperless studios. Never mentioned that. So Hani Rashid was there mentioning a little bit how different he was from Greg and so on. Testa making a view from outside, explaining methodologically how MIT was different from Columbia, very interesting point. And Bernard mentioning the kind of complexity of different vision that he was trying to create, mixing very different people with very different background and intention, and exploring the different potential in different conflictual situation and interpretation that they were. So in a certain way, what you presented today, which is sometimes very useful, trying to build a linear narrative, but in a certain way, I'm sorry Stan, I missed your beginning, but you have never been at the paper studio according to your story, while you were there. not only designing the space.
Right.
Hani Rashid was working in a total different direction than so in a certain way it's like the story of the winner.
Sure.
At least what they appear to be today, the winner.
Sure.
And this is a very New York story.
Sure.
It's absolutely a very North American, East Coast, New York story.
Yeah.
And, you have the genetic,
Yeah.
the genetic. So in a certain way.
Yeah. No, that's.
I'm trying.
Yeah.
Can you go back a little bit more to the try to react to the Bernard description of the paperless as a conflictual space with different options and different directions. And can you tell also a little bit the story of the loser, not only of the winners at this moment?
Sure.
Because being this so New York oriented in a certain way, there is I feel you miss some of the things that were at the paperless that were also connected with other experience, like for example in Europe.
Sure.
And in a certain way, you really can. It's a perfect.
No, absolutely. I mean, what I did say at the beginning is this is a personal history. It's my view of
But I
what
don't know why you
so,
choose that
so,
personal history.
well, I mean, because it's the one I know, but I mean, yeah, look, I mean, I'm happy to, and maybe tomorrow we can discuss more, I mean, because there's a lot we sort of barely scratched the surface of the problem of paperless studios, and I mean, look, I can tell you, Greg taught paperless studios. He taught the first paperless studio, and I taught the other one. So the very first year they were set up, I was teaching a studio, he was teaching a studio. The paperless studio that I taught, I mean, it was the first time I ever used the term field conditions, was in the brief that I wrote for the paperless studio. So if I had an intuition about the computer, it had to do with its sort of abstract, serial, iterative capacities working in the sort of larger field of the city, whereas Greg, as I said, is an object maker and always has been. And yeah, and then I mean, your description is absolutely correct. That basic. This is what I mean. That it's hard to see the originality of what Greg did because it so quickly got taken up by so many different people. And frankly, I mean, if I have a critique, it's exactly that. I mean, it's amazing, in the life of institutions, sometimes these things have a 3 or 4 year, 2 or 3 year history, and the stars were perfectly aligned for 2 or 3 years, and then it became formula, and Columbia was the computer school, and, all the students coming from all over the world to go to the computer school, and then by that time Greg had already moved on, So sure, that was the narrative that the rest of the world saw, right? But there were many different things, and Hani is absolutely correct to insist that what he was doing and what Greg was doing were very, very different. Although what they're doing now is much closer, right? Which is also interesting. I think that Jesse Reiser and Nanako Momoto had a big hand in there. I mean, again, because they were working with a kind of formal vocabulary that turned out to be very sympathetic to the capacities of the computer. But again, that formal interest predated the availability of the technology. So, I'm not sure I want to identify myself this way, but, I mean, again, if there was let's say if there's a project that wasn't taken up more broadly, at least until later, potentially coming out of the paperless studios, it was this project of the field conditions, right? Of something which is more serial, more iterative. Again, it's something that I see coming up now, with the interest in scripting and notation and so on. So yeah, it was and look, I mean, Bernauer is very clever, and we all know that he he had an AA model in mind, and Bernard. I don't think Bernard had this. Bernard had the brilliant intuition that the time was right to bring the computer into the design studio. I don't think he had any idea where it was going to go. And curiously enough, and it's maybe part of maybe what Bernard's anxiety is. I don't want to project, but frankly, it went in ways that Bernard was very uncomfortable with. It went in the direction of a pure formalism, and Bernard was very skeptical about that pure formalism, right? So, so what Bernard knew is he could stage the ecology of these. We were all. I mean, again. Nobody had any work in those days. We were all doing competitions. Hani, Greg, Jesse, myself, Bill McDonald. And we were using, and this is, again, the chemistry was right for Bernard, that we were using the school as a kind of laboratory to work out ideas that we were working out in our own practices. So, when the Cardiff Bay Opera House competition was going, Greg would phone up Jesse and phone up me. He knew everyone was going to be in their office at 2 o'clock in the morning, and he'd call around to us, or he would send faxes to us. So there was conflict, and it is I think very important to not to buy into the narrative that has been accepted, that there was a kind of single formalist agenda in place that everybody lined up in, because there were important differences, even among people that were very sympathetic, and there were conflicts. Yeah, absolutely, that's correct. Yes?
I'm getting a little bit worried about the word overview.
Sure.
At the beginning.
Yeah.
Yes. I started counting. I heard the name of Greg 200 times.
Yeah.
And I think it's more a Greg view.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
At the same time, then you realize that there's other key people
Sure.
that are not mentioned at all.
Yeah.
Especially.
Yeah.
So if you talk about an overview, that's
Sure.
some credit to some other people.
Sure.
And at least one I want to mention now, this one, which was in one of the books we showed.
Yeah.
You already know. It was in the Cyberspace first steps by Pavilion.
Sure.
And it was, of course, the liquid architectures.
Sure.
By Marcus Nolan.
Sure.
So,
Sure.
I know Marcos and Greg were not friends.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems that Greg Lynn is dominating the scene completely.
Sure. Sure.
And there's no reason for it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because Marcos is equally important.
I would honestly, I would.
I'm from you.
Sure.
I'm from
Sure.
you.
Sure.
I'm not from you.
Sure.
So I can see this different.
Yeah.
I can see it's
Yeah.
different.
Sure.
For us,
Sure.
he will be.
Interesting. Yeah. No, look, I said at the beginning, this is.
Say this because it becomes
Yeah.
very.
Look, I don't make any claims for this as being complete. As I said, and anybody who knows my work also knows that, as I said, I don't have a dog in this fight, I do very different work than any of the work that I showed and any of the people I talked about. So, I'm here as somebody who had a kind of fairly privileged view of an admittedly small part of a much larger phenomenon, and this is what I saw, and I don't make any claim for it to be complete, and there especially in the European context, obviously there are a lot of other people. I know Marcus Novak's writings. I know, I don't think they had the impact that Greg did. It's also, I'm invited here in the context of a show that Greg curated, so I thought it might be interesting to talk a little bit about the evolution of his thinking. So, it's simply that. But I make absolutely no claim for this to be complete. And I'm sure there are many other people I've left out.
Okay, so I have a second view.
Okay.
And that is actually, let's start by saying, last week I was in Zurich, 8 years. There was a symposium called Alive 2030, interactive architecture.
Sure.
something you didn't mention.
Yeah,
But a very important fact since at least 2000.
yeah, yeah. All I can say is, I'm not claiming it's a complete view.
I'm not criticizing, I'm simply adding a few
You know,
things.
yeah, absolutely.
Trying to get a
Yeah,
little
yeah.
bit more
There's a
information.
lot of really interesting,
Well,
important people out there.
Well, there's something I'm really worried about.
Yeah.
And that's actually, it resonates what you were saying, with building Pavilion.
Sure,
You see more and more architects building interactive
Sure.
installations, like
Sure.
Lynn, like these things.
Sure.
Interactive installations, they become artists.
sure.
So they actually fade away almost, or slip away,
Right.
or whatever,
Right.
from the basic tasks of building.
Yeah,
So you can say,
Yeah.
okay, this has to do with crisis.
sure.
I think that is an LMI, which is not,
Yeah.
not relevant.
No, I don't know. I mean,
What I think, what should happen,
yeah.
that if we bring back this technology in the heart of
Mhm.
daily activities of building.
Sure.
And that's
Yeah.
not happening right now, and I'm
Yeah.
really worried about this.
Yeah.
Be sure of let it go.
Yeah, well, again, maybe I didn't make myself clear. I share that worry completely, that for me is the Pavilion problem, right? That on the one hand, we can say, yes, it's a convenient vehicle for experimentation, but precisely as you say, I mean, the Pavilion becomes a kind of art object in exhibitions and biennials and so on, and the hard work, in a way, of translating that into real building problems is not taking place. So I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, so what can we do about this?
Well, I think we can do more work. Yeah, Mauricio, yeah.
Where does this idea of smoothness fall? You seem to imply that it's a reaction against fragmentation, but is it possible, you think, to work more on things like genealogy, or where does it come from? Why that language? Was there an intention to create an aesthetics of the period in a way?
Aesthetics of,
As Le Corbusier watched the transatlantic and thinking to derive an aesthetic of modernity, would there have been a moment where smoothness could have sounded the aesthetic of the now? Hence the possibility, even without a computer, it was not even necessary to do the full model that was it? Could we read that also as an attempt to find a kind of response to what was happening in design, car production, industry? Trying to find a language that is fed or was fed as more adequate to represent the contemporary period like that.
yeah, I mean, I think, it's true. You could probably take a similar genealogy. I mean, look at, car design from the 60s and 70s, where the mirror is articulated as a piece of chrome with a connector, and now, everything is a kind of single continuous surface. And I think to some degree, the notion that this was the kind of formal architectural analog to the promised connectivity of the World Wide Web and globalism and the world without boundaries and so on. I mean, I think that you could say that our everyday lives and the world itself, as that was becoming more seamless, that a kind of seamless architecture was the kind of logical result. So I think it was a larger aesthetic project in that, and also, by the way, it had to do also, the discovery of a figure like Friedrich Kiesler, for example. So there was also a kind of reevaluation of a lot of what had been kind of marginal figures to the previous narrative of modernism: Kiesler, Sharon, Carlo Molino. I mean, all of these figures, the sort of to rewrite a kind of new genealogy of continuity, that it wasn't necessarily something that suddenly emerged in the 1990s, but that you could see it. And so I think, yes, I think that was also probably caught up with certain art historical. I mean, this you have to remember. I mean, look. I think people like Mark Wigley and Beatrice Colomina and Michael Hayes, who were saying that the kind of received narratives of modernism could be richer and more complex and could include much more. I mean, certainly, Beatrice's work, thinking about media and photography, for example, that it was this idea that you didn't have to accept the kind of linear narrative of modernism, and that you could come and you could come back and refigure that narrative from within on the example of people like Sharoon and Kiesler and so on. So yeah, I mean it was definitely not something that emerged fully formed at one moment.